We're sitting here in I'm sitting here in North America. My name is Gordon Feller, and I'm pleased to serve as your moderator today for this World Smart City Hangout. I'm here in San Francisco, joined by our presenter, and before I introduce him to you, allow me to tell you a little bit about World Smart City. This is a unique initiative that was launched in January by the International Electrotechnical Commission, which is based in Geneva. And we're joined by some of the IEC executive team on this hangout today. The IEC is joining forces with two other international agencies also based in Geneva, the International Standards Organization and the International Telecommunications Union. And these three organizations are all collaborating together on the World Smart City Forum, which is a 6-month-long experiment and conversation. Today is one of the highlights, and we'll continue this conversation with several more monthly hangouts that lead us to the summit, the July 13 event in Singapore, the World Smart City Forum, that we'll talk more about later. But first, apologies to any of you who may have difficult connectivity issues. It makes me look like Michael Jackson in his moonwalk mode, but that's sometimes the reality of local broadband connections. We have 1 hour together today, and we're going to have half of our session presented by Scott in a moment, and the other half for your questions and answers and discussion. We're joined today by Sylvia Presley, who's sitting in the UK and who's serving as our executive producer for the event. And she may chime in at some point to make sure that we stay on track, and that's much appreciated. You have a chat window at the bottom right where in blue you can ask your questions, make your comments. We invite you to tweet along the way at World Smart City on the Twitter feed, which I'll be watching as Scott presents and as your comments either show up in the chat box or in the Twitter feed. We have two groups participating today in live. Some you see on the screen in the boxes below, and some who are invisible to us. We'll also be posting this on YouTube for another community of participants who will join us after the fact, and we'll get details posted on the World Smart City Forum website so you can see where that YouTube link is. We'll be muting everybody until there's questions and discussion, but let me introduce Scott to you, who's here from San Francisco. Scott serves as the lead executive inside Microsoft here in North America, focused on civic innovation and civic technology. He's had a long career, more than a dozen years at Microsoft, serving in a lot of different roles, including building technology, and now what he's doing is applying the power of technology with cities who are partnered with Microsoft, multiple cities in the US that you'll hear about, and of course his colleagues are working around the world. So I've gotten to know Scott very well. He's one of the smartest and most modest people you'll meet, and he's also really working in the trenches, getting his hands dirty around these issues of private data, open data, city data, and all of the intermingling of those topics. So we want to thank you for taking time out today, Scott. We know Friday is sometimes a busy day at the end of the week, but we're glad to have you, so the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Gordon, and thank you all for joining us, particularly those that are in awkward time zones this time of day. What I really want to talk a little bit about is the world of privacy and how that can greatly, if we get it right, can do a great job of enabling what we can do with technology in cities, and if we get it wrong, how it will create some social tension and how we need to sort of think through some of these larger pictures. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch over to some slides that will help drive some of our conversation, and then in 20 minutes or so, I'll be happy to field some questions. So if I can get the technology working here, we're going to share, and I am sharing that, I believe. And my slide deck is up, correct?
We see it in a small box.
Okay. Let's see. Let me stop sharing.
This darn Google technology.
I know. Let me restart the slide deck. And then we go go back over here to share.
While you're doing that, I'll tell people that this will be available as presentation slides as well as the video. So we see it now, Scott.
Okay, perfect. So, as Gordon said, Director of Technology Civic Innovation at Microsoft. I'm based here in San Francisco. And before I sort of get into the details of the privacy, I want to do a little ground setting on just why Microsoft cares about cities. And so, for a lot of it comes down to we really see we all have heard the discussions of the demographic shift back into cities. But what that really also means is that that's where the demographic and political power are going. We see them really as the innovation hubs, because at least here in North America, where I'm based, we have a lot of aging infrastructure, we have limited budgets, we have some political challenges, and therefore cities really, they don't have the opportunity to pick and choose who they serve. They need to serve all their residents, and that's that constraint is fostering a lot of really interesting innovation. There's also a lot of money going in. GovTech, there's just a GovTech fund that was raised for $24 million. IDC says there's going to be $6.4 billion, give or take, spent in technology in cities. So there's certainly a market opportunity, and quite honestly, there's an opportunity just to greatly improve the lives of people, which is something else we're passionate about. So the other question is, so we talk about cities. So why Microsoft? There isn't a skew for the Microsoft city. But what we really see is an opportunity as a large tech player that has a significant market presence to look at some of the solutions and things that are happening in single cities and say, oh, we have people, we're a global company. We have people in Cairo, we have people in Tokyo, we have people in Singapore. We can help scale these interesting solutions out because of our footprint. We also, we think in terms of multiple releases. So, how do we sustain these solutions over time? A lot of technology moves at much faster cycles than city plant infrastructure. Cities think of things in 30, 40-year cycles at times, and today's phone app is often not that cycle. So we are looking to help bridge those two. So that's the context of why Microsoft is playing in cities. Sort of give the standard. What are the Megatrends slide? And I'm not going to dive into these, but I want to talk a little bit about how they relate in terms of privacy. And a lot of the items here really have great privacy implications. And the one I'd start with really is sort of the ubiquitous connectivity and the computing ecosystem. We're really seeing computers disappear. We talk about the personal computer, being a coming out of the late 80s and early 90s, but quite honestly, I would argue your phone is your first personal computer. The earlier personal computers were either at home, they were shared across the family, or they were sitting on your desk. They were work computers. My phone is with me everywhere. It knows who my contacts are. It knows where I am. It has some of my most intimate information on it, and it's mine. Nobody else has. I don't share that with anybody else, and therefore that provides a lot of rich information to greatly customize experiences for us. But we need to do that in a way where we respect people's privacy. And I'll get a little bit more into what that means by respecting privacy. So it's just some examples of what you can get from phones. Proximity. That implies relationships. Who am I near regularly? So during the day, people that are nearby me are probably my coworkers. In the early evening, it's probably my social acquaintances, my friends. In the evening, it's family. And that can become information that leaks out if we're not careful. That leaking can be a great thing because that helps me coordinate work meetings. It helps me coordinate social events with my friends. Let's go to the restaurant we all like. And it helps me understand what my loved ones are doing and how to reach them when I want. But it could also be used for nefarious reasons. That location also implies activity. Am I at a museum? Am I at a big sports event? Do I go to a lot of music shows? Am I at an establishment with that people may make moral judgments about? These are things that can be used, once again, to customize experiences, or they can be used to discriminate against people. It can also be used to determine income. Do I frequent expensive restaurants, or do I frequent less expensive restaurants? So all this information together is great, and it can enable digital assistants to sort through just really the overwhelming options of choices throughout our lives, and as I talked about, tailoring them to things that are useful for us. The first time I saw Amazon recommendations or Netflix recommendations, it was kind of freaky. But it stopped being weird when I realized how absolutely valuable they were. And I've read a lot of great books. I've seen movies that I would have never come across had it not been for those recommendations. The downside of that is where there are suggestions, there will be marketers. And those marketers may wish to skew the recommendations and suggestions to things that may or may not be perfectly aligned with my taste, but may be more aligned with their business interests. And how do we balance those two? How do we fund these personalization engines we talk about that are useful to me, but may provide some conflicts of interest? And finally, there's just the risk of surveillance states using them in ways that we in free societies may be less comfortable with. So that's sort of the context that I want us to just set up front of things that are possible, both good and bad, as we get all this information that is leaking off all of these devices now that everything becomes digital. So those are the trends in terms of technology. And let me now switch and talk a little bit about privacy trends. And so let's first start off with privacy is a tough thing to define, and so what I use as my working definition is really respecting people's ability to control what happens to their information and how it's used. I may, as one person, may be very privacy protective and not want to share a whole lot, or I may be someone who believes that privacy didn't get over. Either way, those are choices that people get to make. What we want to do is we want to provide means of letting people control how that data is used, as well as who gets to see it, where else it's distributed. Does it go just to one party, or can those parties share it? And if I want, can I be left alone? So with those sort of contexts of privacy, how do those lay over the tech trends we were talking about? Well, one thing we're seeing is trust is becoming really important as people adopt new technologies. People are similar to in the 80s and 90s, where people made ethical decisions around military engagement in terms of alcohol and tobacco, in terms of ethical treatment of animals. We're now seeing people making similar market decisions around their trust of the parties they're doing business with. I talked earlier on the digitization of everything and how it's when things were analog, we couldn't share at scale. Things that were written in my journal were, they may not be private, but they are nearly impossible to extract out and do anything interesting with at a technical level. Now that is all stored in Evernote, in OneNote, in my email, that becomes much easier to mine, to pass around. A lot of the really sort of interesting product that we're seeing is done on terms of data analysis. The ability to search the web is largely a data exercise. A web search is not, the product there is data. The data of the web served up to me very personally based on a set of 4, 5, 6 words that I enter into a big white box. We're seeing a lot of interest in consumers, citizens, regulators, as we start to find people, as we start out for data breaches, as we start to create constructs around, legal constructs around how people can share data. We have differing views in different parts of the world. We're starting to see data sovereignty laws come up. So data is something that is really falling into the legal system, and all these are really sort of come back down to the sort of the basic model of privacy. So with that sort of trends, let me talk a little bit about methods of how we can and should be looking at the management of the data. And sort of I look at it in 4 quadrants. There is what rights I have as an individual around my data. I have some discussions around how that data is controlled. controls put on that, the life cycle of that information, and then finally the management and compliance around that. So let's walk through those. So as an individual, we should be providing notice to people around what data is being collected. I should be able to choose whether I wish that data to be collected or not. So I have a choice. I have to consent to it, and I should be able to find out what information is being collected. When we look at controls of that information, that really comes down to, is it maintained well? Is my personally identifying information, my financial information, my health information, is it properly encrypted so that if it were to leak out, it would not be useful? Are there any controls on the quality? We all hear stories of bad credit reports, of bad health data that really has impacts on people's lives. So how do we not only secure the data, but how do we make sure that the data we collect is actually accurate, and is there a means of correcting it when it's incorrect? On the information lifecycle, it really sort of goes through 3 phases. First, there's the collection of it. How do we get it? Then there is the use of it. How long do we keep it? How is it used? And then finally, there is the destruction or transfer out at the end. And I think that's one thing that we as an industry don't necessarily think so well about, is the destruction of that data. Things have a useful life cycle, and how do we get rid of it? If we're making traffic projections, how long will it take me from get to point A to point B? Well, that's tracking some personal information, because you got my phone, so you know who I am, you know where I am now, and you know where I'm going. And over time, that creates a very good breadcrumb trail of my activities, and could be used to discern information that I might not want to share. However, it's really useful to me in the moment, but that information at a detail level is probably not useful 10 minutes after I get to my destination. Might be useful for traffic predictions later on, but we could destroy a whole lot of that data essentially immediately after use, and we don't really think that through as well as we could. And then finally, the last piece is the management and accountability of it. What sort of governmental, if it's data in the government's hands, if it's data in private sector's hands, what sort of controls do we have and accountability for the employees that have access to that? How is that monitored? And what's the enforcement mechanism if someone should violate some of their the legal requirements around that? The other thing we should talk about is really the different types of data, because not all data is the same. I look at, there's really 4 buckets of data. You realize I tend to like quadrants. There's anonymous data. There is kind of pseudo-anonymous data. It might be identifying but can't be tied back to me. There's personally identifying information, and then there's highly sensitive information. So let's dive into those 4 things. So anonymous data, it's things like configuration stats. When you send a web request to a website, you get configuration of the browser. What version of the browser is it? Is JavaScript enabled? Do they have a video player? That helps the publishing party create this, render down the appropriate content. But once again, it's anonymous. Performance statistics fall in that category. Aggregation of data across multiple users, where there's really no way to extract out individual movement or purchasing patterns or the such. It starts to become pseudo-anonymous when we start having some sort of identifier in there. So how do we track session state across multiple web views? How do we track it across sites that I visit for advertising? How do we track it to be able to identify that user driving down the road that we're providing traffic predictions for is the same user that left 5 minutes ago, 10 minutes, a mile down the road. So how I tend to figure out where it falls into one side or the other, because the pseudo-anonymous is sort of the bridge between anonymous and person identifiable information. So if it's got an ID in it, be that a GUID, be that an IP address, be that a cell phone, that then becomes pseudo-anonymous, because you now can track it back to an entity of some sort. It then falls over into the person identifiable side if there's a way of linking that ID back to something that identifies me and allows me to get contacted. So is that an email address? is that a cell phone number that is not just a throwaway number, but that is actually the cell phone that I use regularly? Does it come back to an address? Does it come back to a linked enough information where you could accurately identify me? I was reading a study a while back that given 5 points of travel, people will be throughout a day, people will be able to uniquely be identified. So there are no other people, very few other people that share the same 5 starting locations, work locations, lunch locations. Pick your 5 points during the day, and that's you. Unless you are that is enough to identify who an individual is. And then finally, when you get down into sensitive information, that's generally culture specific. People think different information is sensitive, but it largely falls in things that would allow identity theft, that would provide for some level of discrimination if that type of information is viewed differently across societies. And across the board, usually healthcare data is connected. It is part of that. Another thing that we should think about as we're building applications is this concept of data minimalization. We just from a privacy perspective. Now this is different than sort of a big data perspective, but as we're talking about data on people, generally the less data you collect, the better. So examples are web pages that when you get sort of the web request, it sends off a gob of information. If all you're really trying to do is collect information in the form that they entered in, we don't really need all their browser stats. We don't need the location that we can figure out from the IP address. So as we're building applications, from a privacy perspective, we should be thinking about trying to minimize what we store, using it for only as long as we need it, and then destroy it as soon as possible. Obviously, when we think about big data, things that flow off of sensors are often things that we want to collect more of because we don't know what will be useful later. But a lot of that data is anonymous, and that should be fairly safe to keep. The aggregate, what was often said is that now that we see this cost of storage decreasing so dramatically, particularly cloud storage, it really is cheaper just to store things than it is to make a decision of what you want later or what you might need later. Or it's cheaper to store it than to apply the compute in order to aggregate that into some other format. So we're seeing that from just a pure sensor standpoint, but I would advocate that we should be doing collecting less data about individuals. So an activity that on the work that I do, that we often an exercise we go through is to work through all the data elements and articulate exactly how it's being used later, and articulate how that answer can't be collected in some other manner. And if we can't say how we're using it, or if we can't point to a way that same decision, that same information can't be determined in some other manner, then we tend to argue that is data that we should not collect. And then the last piece I want to talk about here, before we get into some examples, is just the idea of consent. I talked earlier about sort of the rights of the individual, and one is to know what's being collected and to consent to it. And consent sort of falls into a couple categories. You can have consent that is very prominent, or consent that's discoverable. So prominent consent is click-through screens. In order to use the application, in order to use the service, you must agree. Discoverable comes down to it's a privacy policy, and usually what we tend to think of which should you use is if there is a risk, and we can get into questions of what risk is. In the questions we can talk about a little bit about what risk is. But if there's a privacy risk, you probably want a more prominent display of consent. If there's less privacy risk, if you are just serving up a web page and you're providing information, that can be discoverable. There's some you track some things. You can't serve a web page without an IP address, but if you don't really doing anything else, that's fine. If you're tracking location, if you are creating a personal history of people's shopping behavior, you might want more of a prominent disclosure. And then finally, there's whether you are opting in explicitly. We collect this data, okay? and you have to say yes, you can collect these pieces of data, or more of an opt out of unless I say otherwise, we're going to collect this data for you. And then finally, there's this concept that I think is starting to emerge around implicit consent, and that is just by the very nature of using the application, it's obvious that you're giving consent. And the example I use is twofold. One is your IP address. If you are bringing up a web page, implicitly you are giving consent to share that IP address, because without IP addresses, the internet is broken. Another one is mapping. Anytime you want maps from here to somewhere, you are implicitly giving consent to knowing where here is. Now, you may want more explicit consent on storage of here. As I talked about earlier, that's kind of useless in 10 minutes. But it's very useful right now when I want to get from here across town. And implicitly, I'm giving the application consent to knowing that. But I'm not necessarily giving consent to being able to store that over time. So that's sort of some trends on privacy, how I think that we as a technology industry should be looking at privacy, and how we can be good citizens in that space. So let's give a couple examples here. And so I stole a graphic from some other presentation that gives sort of the benefits of transportation in smart cities, and how do we reduce congestion, how do we be more efficient, how do we reduce costs, how do we get just-in-time delivery. You can read the slide. There's nothing particularly interesting or novel about that, particularly if you saw last month's discussion that Graham did on mobility. But this gives me an opportunity to talk about a handful of interesting questions that it raises. And so you see on the right-hand side, there's sort of four actors: city manager, who is responsible for optimizing transportation. There's someone who's responsible for a fleet of vehicles of some sort that needs to route them across city so that they can service residents or they can deliver packages. And then finally, there's a citizen who just simply wants mobility to get around town and wants stuff delivered to them. Who, in this question, owns the data? Who are we asking consent from? Who gets to? Who needs to respect that? It's a fairly complex interaction and ecosystem of data flows, and we, as a society, I don't believe we haven't articulated that well. So, an example from the healthcare space or from the scientific space is, let's imagine I'm doing a research project, and Scott, I'm a subject in that, and it's healthcare related, so maybe they're taking some blood, and that blood is given to a researcher at a university, who then publishes a paper. He or she is an employee of a university, and that research was funded by the government. There's 4 or 5 people in that chain, and who owns it? Well, it's my blood, so maybe I own the data. Or I'm the researcher, and I put all the brain power into it, and I'm the one that came up with the findings, and I'm the one that would like to monetize that, or I'm the one that wants to do future research on that. I'm the university. I'm the long-term steward of that research over multiple generations, and I want to make sure that it's not lost. I want to make sure that it is published appropriately so that we advance science. And I'm the government official that wrote the check. And lastly, the person that I didn't talk about was the residents who funded that with their tax dollars. Without sort of implicit agreement, or without explicit agreement, without a sort of societal understanding, it's not clear who really is the person that at every level should give consent. We have kind of come to an expectation that we need informed consent in terms of medical procedures. But when we put that in the world of transit, am I giving consent when I get on a bus? Am I giving consent as I drive over a sensor? Is that implicit, that driving over a sensor, I am optimizing a transit network? I believe, obviously, I live in technology. I live in smart cities. I live in the world of smart cities. I think that we want more data. We want to be able to make more smart decisions. But we need a way of understanding how that is shared so that our citizens and our residents feel comfortable in that space, that it's not creepy when things are personalized. Because we need trust in our government services. We need transparency. We need people who feel comfortable with what the government is doing, what our private sector businesses are doing, and they're not abusing that. So it comes back a lot down to transparency, so that people understand how it's being used. And in general, they're willing to transfer off some level of privacy for great services. The example I often talk about is if you'd roll back 15, maybe 20 years, and you had told people that you would share your most intimate desires, things that you wanted to know more about, with monstrous companies who would then use that and mine that, sell ads against it, and customize your view of the world based on that, we would probably be all fairly freaked out. But we do that. We make that transaction every day when we do a web search, and we think that that's great value. Being able to search this nearly unnavigatable thing called the web, and we have companies that make that serve up very relevant content to us. We trade a little privacy in terms of a history that's very identifiable back to us and what our interests are, but we get a great product. That's worthwhile. We don't have that yet in smart cities. We haven't come to that societal understanding of what that value trade-off is for a level of privacy around our activities in cities and how we deliver better services to that. The other thing I want to hit on briefly is, we've talked here a lot about personal data, and what we haven't thought through a lot is private data that belongs to companies, and trade secrets buried in that. So the canonical example is various rideshare companies. We would love to have access to their data so that we can make better routing decisions across multi-modes of transit, how we make payment across that, how we optimize that, where we put our bus stops, where we put our transit locations. But buried in that is their private data. Is there a way that we could, as a society, get access to the value of that data for things that are in our purview around decision-making and planning, but doesn't expose their business models to their competitors, doesn't open them up to undue regulation that other entities would not be subject to who do not share that data. So I just want to throw that piece into the mix. I think I'm running out of time, so I can talk a little bit about some things that Microsoft is doing around tracking people connect, our video gaming device, and how that can get into rehabilitation, how that can get into fall detection. So if people are interested, I can hit that in the questions. The last thing that I'm just going to run through really quickly here, it will be in the slide deck that will be shared, are a set of resources. And there are a set of web pages here that I just got screen grabs of. Tech and Policy is one that Tech Academics and Policy is one that Microsoft runs. That is sort of a virtual think tank of interesting conversations, privacy, interoperability, intellectual property. There is the Federal Trade Commission's website. There is the European Union's website, and there's a handful of law firms and academics that have blogs around privacy, and I've run through those. Lastly, the presentation available. You can find the team on Twitter at Microsoft SVs in Silicon Valley, me at Elfscott, and there's a blog of Microsoft Bay Area. And also, I think as we open up this for questions, I got some nasty, so I think someone potentially in the meeting twice, taking it both, say, on the cell phone and on their laptop. And so with that, Gordon, if you want to fire off some questions, and thank you for fixing the echo. If you want to fire off some questions, that'd be great. Or did we need Gordon? Or have I been talking to myself and no one has been listening because I've been on mute and no one's been able to tell me that?
No, we've heard you.
Okay.
Just waiting for Gordon.
Gordon should be okay. I can see
Well, we have some feedback here too. So while we wait for Gordon, and he can just interrupt me when he gets back, I will go back to the slide where I was going to talk about the Kinect sensor. And so what we found is the Kinect sensor comes with the Xbox. It tracks joints essentially, and it's spectacular for gaming. But what we also found is that when we record a lot of that, individuals moving around, people of different ages, we're able to do a great job at predicting falls because we can track people's gait and balance because we've done this over aggregate. So we track people moving around. And there's a couple things about that. First, we can see if someone's fallen because the shape of the body changes from vertical to horizontal. And track the joints as they move and determine how hard the person fell. Did they hit their head? And also, we can track their position so we know if the person got up or not. This becomes interesting for physical therapy because we can track how quickly people are recovering after surgery, after strokes. And this allows us to give more resources to the people who are tracking less well and fewer resources to people who are recovering well on their own already. Great societal value. We're able to improve the people's quality of life. They're able to engage in their rehabilitation with less one-on-one tracking of expensive physical therapists and doctors. Those doctors are able to spend their valuable time on people who they can make more progress with because they need additional help. But we're tracking people as they walk around the house. There's a independent living facility, I think in Missouri, state in the United States, that uses that they put a bunch of Kinects and other sensing devices around their facility, and they're able to, by analyzing people's gait, determine who is at risk of falling, and then intervene before they actually have a fall. Get them walkers, give them fall training, maybe move them to a different level of acuity. Highly invasive, but actually has some pretty good societal value. Kinect can track you through your day. We talk a lot about putting sensors, passive sensors in bridge infrastructure to determine when metal is fatiguing. Well, we can put that same sensor in your house to find out when you're fatiguing. We can put that same set of microphones in there to determine if you have termites. Are those trade-offs we want to make as a society? I don't know. But these are things that are possible from a technology perspective once we come to terms with what privacy we expect from our government and our technology providers, and what we further, what we're willing to trade for better experiences. So with that, I will now take questions.
All right.
Okay.
Hopefully you can hear me, Scott.
Yes, I can, Gordon.
Good. So this theme of trade-offs is crucial because it's part of the challenge that we face to make decisions as this train is moving out of the station, as data for cities, by cities, about cities is being created. We have to decide what benefits come with what risks or sharing of data that we thought once upon a time was 100% private. And now we may have to reframe it so it's no longer about trade-offs. So the first question in that spirit is about the problem of hacking the city. The malicious hacker of the city is mitigating the cybersecurity hack going to be improved, the prospect for preventing that going to be improved by a different way of thinking about who owns the data? Is the smart city solution where there's data sharing going to be approached in a way, or could it be approached in a way that reduces the potential for malicious attack, but also keeps open the option of getting the public benefits that you were describing, whether in health or any of the other categories that you laid out in your presentation?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think hopefully I've switched back to video and off of the slides. It hits on a fair number of questions, and I think it particularly as we start publishing more and more open data, it first comes to the question of what do we wish to publish. So in Chicago, we're doing a lot of work around mapping the underground infrastructure of the city. It's an older city, and quite honestly, my understanding is they don't know what's all down there. They don't. It's many years old, decades old that they've built stuff, and what it means is when they start doing construction, they often find things. So it delays construction because they have to figure out what it is, what's in that pipe before they cut through it. It's expensive because maybe they need to route around things, and it's dangerous because there may be infrastructure in there that blows up when you cut it. But it's also concerning from an infrastructure standpoint, public safety standpoint, because I, as a city, have a desire to make more data available because it will improve construction companies' ability to efficiently build things, less disruption to residents, quicker return to value to get that street fixed, get that building built. But if I share too much, the bad actors you mentioned, Gordon, can see that and find choke points where there's critical infrastructure that can do more damage. So non-redundant electrical infrastructure, water mains, things that we wouldn't want to know. So coming up with a model for sort of collaborating on that data in a way that segments it, similar to my conversation of the different classifications of private data, anonymous, pseudo-anonymous, person identifiable, and highly sensitive. We should have a similar model for city data around infrastructure. What is wide open, what is sensitive, what is proprietary to the operations of the government, finance records, say, that are not subject to sunshine laws, and then finally critical infrastructure that we would want to keep more highly guarded. So there's a lot of work around sort of encryption schemes, putting different gateways across them, homographic, I think I'm mispronouncing that, encryption that allows me to do calculations on encrypted data without ever decrypting it. You know, right now a lot of the work that's done is you take data, you decrypt it, you do math on it, and you re-encrypt it. Well, while it is unencrypted, it becomes available for attackers. So that was what happened with Target. Is there was a period of time, as I understand it, when credit card data was not yet encrypted because it was going through a verification process, and that's where it was stolen. Once it got back into the proper storage, it was properly encrypted. So I think that Microsoft is working on sort of what we're calling a data commons, a data collaborative, which is how we can get different entities to contribute data. There is technically and policy. There is policy, metadata, articulated, defined rights and responsibilities that come with that data, who it can be shared with, who can change it, and then there is technically enforced policy around that, both through security ACLs as well as encryption that prevent it leaking out, and then finally there would be trusted parties that would write APIs against that would expose it out. So a canonical example there, once again, is the rideshare data. If you wanted to have a single payment mechanism across rideshare, bike share, and public transit, and so I could pay all three of those at once, I would need to get some information from a ride-sharing company, but I may not need to know the endpoint and the starting point that might be considered proprietary to them. But if they simply return a dollar amount to me of $3.14, that could be something that I could then combine with the $2 bus fare and the free, because I'm a member of bike share, and charge me the appropriate amount. One thing I am explicitly not getting into, and I don't wish to, but it's been well discussed in legal briefs and in the public forum, is just the how law enforcement fits into this. So there is an angle around encryption in law enforcement that's well in the press, and I'm going to leave that to the policymakers and attorneys to find out. That's something I'm happy. It's something we need to discuss. It's in the public forum. We need to have more discussions around that, but I'm not going to weigh in this conversation.
All right, so Boston is one of the cities that you're working in, and I noticed that Boston was able to strike up the first deal with Uber, where Uber is sharing anonymized data that helps the city planners and traffic managers in Boston understand who's using Uber at what time of day, from what neighborhood to what other neighborhood are they being transported, so that I think what Boston's planning is to take that type of anonymized Uber user data and try to make judgments about where should there be city transit solutions, whether it's a bus route that's being rerouted or a bus schedule that's being rescheduled, or maybe it's new services like paratransit services of the kind that we see with the airport shuttles. And so I guess my question is, if Boston is succeeding in doing that with Uber, would you predict that some of those types of Ubers and Lyfts of the world providing services within the city environment are going to be pressured by city governments to make more of their anonymized data available to city digital managers who can understand and analyze the data for the benefit of the common good? Is that something that's a likely trend in the future?
I think so. You know, so I'm not privy to the details of the deal in Boston, and I'm aware of it from sort of press and editorial and technical blogging and Twitter sphere of people's the interests on both sides of that. I think something will get worked out. It is in Uber's best interest to optimize, and this is all rideshare, not just Uber, to optimize transit in cities, and that comes from data. And they are they have a lot of that data, as do cities. Cities ultimately they own the right of way. They control the roads. We see similar things at the national level with governments are sovereign. They get to set the boundaries of how companies do business within their borders, and all of us in the tech industry have had different arrangements with different countries based on their sovereignty. They get to decide what privacy means to them. As I somewhat jokingly say, governments have armies, therefore they get to set the rules. Cities don't have armies in most cases, but they do have the ability to control their right of way. They have the ability to make it easy or difficult for people to do business. And I think that there will be we will get it worked out both on a policy level for what is good for cities, and at the same time protecting the legitimate interests of private sector companies that don't want their competitors reverse engineering their business models by diving into their data or finding their competitive disadvantages in rideshare. Where aren't they signed? Where don't they have enough drivers? Where are there longer waits? So therefore, we're going to put more marketing resources in this neighborhood so one company can defeat another company or compete with another company. I don't think I understand the rideshare company's interest in not having that happen, but I personally believe there are ways both through the level of anonymization of data, the granularity of the data, and that sort of data commons that I talked about earlier, that we can provide university researchers, we can provide government institutions the answers to questions of how many buses should we run down such and such a route, how often should they run. Here in San Francisco we have Chariot, a private provider of transit that crowdsources their routes. You essentially say, I want this new route, and you plan out what the route is on their website, and people vote on it, and once they get, I don't know the number, it's something like 100 people that sign up for it, they believe that they can then run a business around that. And so I think there is, we're already seeing that in the private sector. I see that cities could start using Uber, Lyft, rideshare data around that same space. And the other thing, Gordon, that you didn't mention, you talked about changing route service and bringing in paratransit new lines. But I think there's also an opportunity to look through and see where it is that maybe they don't need to provide service because those are well provided by rideshare. There isn't enough traffic on a 80-person bus, and maybe that's something that that cities should optimize their resources somewhere else. And are there ways they could underwrite other types of transit in areas that are not efficient to be served by what we currently think of as mass transit?
Great, very helpful. And by the way, one other option, of course, is to have those very congested routes given access to higher speed broadband on a experimental basis to see whether telecommuting could be incentivized for those people who might otherwise be doing physical commuting. So when we talk about trying to reduce congestion within a city's traffic system, it may be that the city determines that investing in higher speed connectivity in a particular neighborhood where there are a lot of trips starting could be a way to enable people to reduce their either need to commute on a certain day of the week, instead of 5 days of work commute, 4 days, or maybe staggering their work because they can begin their work life with a higher connection that allows the type of video conferencing that we're doing now. So Peter at the International Electrotechnical Commission asked a great question, which I'll put forward. and you've already shared your view about this to some extent, but I want to articulate it maybe in the way that he has. He talks about free public Wi-Fi and other types of free city services. The question he's asking is it really worth it on the condition that the companies that provide the service get the opportunity to collect, store, and analyze the user's valuable personal location and behavior data? Now, you made the case in your presentation that the trade-off was probably worthwhile because you're getting, as the citizen/consumer, access to a range of services that would otherwise not be available if that trade-off didn't occur. I guess the question is, as that data becomes more widely accessible to a greater number of parties, the data about me, the user of a free Wi-Fi service from a company of any kind, at what point does the citizen or consumer think that the trade-off is no longer beneficial? Is there a threshold that we know from behavioral research or from consumer research, which I know Microsoft does a lot of? Maybe there is no point at which we have a common threshold for people.
Yeah, I have two answers to that. So one, I don't know the short answer. I don't know the threshold, but let me give a couple perspectives that may sort of enlighten some of my thinking on that. So first off, just to take a completely different angle on the question, I was at a data ownership conference that Citrus put on, which Citrus is a consortium of 5 or 6 University of California campuses, and it was on who owns your data. And it was an international conference, largely by some Berkeley researchers, UC Berkeley, and ENRIA, which is a French research organization. And it was, as someone that was fairly new to this conversation, I was fascinated by the concerns that North Americans versus Europeans shared around data ownership. By and large, the Europeans were much more concerned about private use of data and what companies would be doing with it. And by and large, the Americans were much more concerned about what the government would do with that. And so, sort of the other spin on that, on Peter's question was, businesses being able to mine that data. But I think a lot of civil libertarians would also be equally worried about governments being able to do that. So, an alternative to free Wi-Fi would be to outsource it to a private-public partnership, or to 100% turned over commercially and have the city underwrite it, and in the hands of, you name it, Teleco. But I'm not sure that everyone would be happy having that same level of scrutiny sitting on government servers, where you could imagine repressive states using that poorly. You could imagine people that gets published, and people that have vendettas, people that have political motives digging into that. So I think that we need to think about, that data is sensitive, and how do we, and who gets to access it, and whose hands do we feel more comfortable it being in. As for the trade-off question, that needs to be funded somehow. The Wi-Fi ferry has not yet come and made the cost of that zero. And right now, the primary funding mechanisms for data and telecom infrastructure is either subscription-based, you pay a fee for it, or it's advertising-based. And for the most part, there isn't a large uptake on people willing to subscribe to pay for to underwrite wireless plans, even at a sort of a small scale, let alone the idea of blanketing a city with that. So you've got not only the cost you need to figure out is, how do you dig up the streets and put the fiber in? How do you climb up all the telephone poles and put in the wireless access points, or whatever the technology you're going to need. So there's the capital piece. There is the cost of the data itself, and then there's finally the maintenance, which is not insignificant. And the trade-off right now is people seem to be more willing to trade off some privacy and some access, maybe just because they don't understand and it's abstract and they don't know how that is being used. But until we find a financing mechanism that is something else, that seems to be the game right now.
All right, that's very helpful to get that perspective. And I guess there's one time for one last question, and it really goes to one element of this that you didn't speak to very much during the presentation. So it's a chance to fill a gap, and it's about procurement. Here's the question as it was written. How much of a role does a broken and siloed technology procurement process play out in the risk of cybersecurity breach for cities? So an example is offered. 34 municipalities in Miami means 34 different procurement departments for a smart cities initiative. So I think the question was about the the vulnerability of having multiple procurement systems, but I guess I would add on to that, the broader question of, do we need, if we want to see smart cities emerge in our lifetime, do we need to change something, maybe many things, maybe one particular thing about the way that cities do their procurement?
Yes, it's a great question. It touches on a lot of things. I think it will be sort of a great wrap up, because it will allow discussion to hit a lot of different pieces. So procurement today is largely a result of solving of the progressive. And speaking from a North American perspective, is America, that's what I know. But it is, it's an outgrowth of the first progressive era of trying to prevent corruption, and we put in lots of hurdles and sunshine laws and effort and to make sure that our public servants were not corrupt and were not self-dealing. And I think that we, in a modern era, I think that the expectations of public services change, and I think there's less corruption, but that may be naive. But I think more importantly is that we can look more towards setting guidelines for what type of activities, what type of procurement, what type of contracting we expect. And we now have data. We now have technology that can look for violations. So as opposed to solving up front and taking huge cost in terms of efficiency, in terms of security, I'll touch on in a second, we could do analysis of spend across government institutions, who that's spent with, what the relationships between people are, what the ownership is, and we could flag things that look fraudulent. My credit card company could do that. I don't know why we couldn't do that in a procurement scheme. We also have procurement schemes that are really, from a technology perspective, were built up in this sort of the Big Bang era of 5-year projects where you write an RFP and then you get a budget and then you do a design and then you do a spec. You sort of march through this over time and you deliver this wonderful thing 5 years later when the technology is completely changed. And I see what a lot of cities are doing is they're moving to much more agile, sprint-based initiatives as much as they can. Big projects still need to go through procurement cycles because there are incumbents that benefit from that, and they're reluctant to see those change. We're seeing that on the smaller projects, and we're seeing more and more people come into government service that have a technology background, that understand, that have grown up with technology, that have come from a technology sector, and they know how to run successful projects. If you look at sort of healthcare.gov in the U.S., how that was run at first, and then how quickly that was turned around, a lot of that was different technique of how you build software, and we'll see more and more of that. On the security standpoint, the question touched on, sort of the Byzantine number of different overlapping government entities and how that relates to a cybersecurity standpoint. And there's a good news and bad news there. The bad news is, all 39 or however many of those agencies that were mentioned need to get it right. And if one gets it wrong, that's all that you need. The proverbial good guys need to be right 100% of the time, and the bad guys need to be right once. So in a cloud-oriented world, we, the cloud providers, have the resources and the reputation risk to devote a lot to security and making sure that we get it right. It only needs, there's fewer places for things to go wrong. There's one set of cloud infrastructure at the cloud provider. So there's a handful of cloud providers, but each of those there's sort of one governance body around that, and it's easier to manage that across those entities. The downside is, that's one set of hugely valuable data. In the 34 example world, you're not if you get to compromise all of the Miami area, you'd have to get all 34 of them, which is unlikely. If that were all moved to a cloud, and if that one cloud provider were to get compromised, that's one shot. So far, the cloud providers have been fairly successful in that space, and and that seems to be a good model. But I think back to the sort of the procurement process of how we build software, of each agency and each government having to do it themselves and reinvent wheels is something that we need to look through, both from a governance perspective of how we do it, and also a governance perspective of where money is spent. And to sort of wrap it all up and tie it back to privacy, me as a citizen, as a resident, it's difficult for me to understand 34 different privacy policies and 34 different ways that all those institutions are going to use my data, and to understand what and if I view differently, having to contact all of them to opt out of something. So it's not only a security standpoint that you bring up in terms of vulnerability. It's not only a efficiency and a likelihood of failure of a project that I bring up in terms of the Byzantine old school style methods that we build software in cities, but it's also just a privacy perspective, which is back to the topic of this hangout, which is they're not going to be consistent, and I as a tech provider would like consistency. I as a resident would like consistency, because that, as a resident, I get expectations, I know what to expect, and I can hold people accountable when they get outside of that. And I, as a tech provider, I have a spec I can go build up against, and I have a societal expectation that when I build X, it will be adopted because people will like it. And I think with that, we're at time. So Gordon, thank you so much for fielding questions, and and Sylvia for organizing this. It's been a great opportunity for me to get some viewpoints from other people, and the questions have been spectacular. So thank you for including me.
Thank you, Scott, so much for being part of this, and we'll be posting this on YouTube so that your distant relatives in the year 2035 will know what your thinking was here in 2016.
Gosh, I hope I'm right. If not, they're gonna. It's for all of posterity. I'll be mocked.
It'll be on YouTube in a few seconds. Thanks so much. See you soon. Bye-bye.